I'm going to talk about the ethical foundations of social choice and about sustainability, and the two are closely connected. First of all, why do I talk about ethics? This is an economics course. Well, environmental economics is all about the allocation, distribution, and use of environmental resources. And in that sense, environmental economics is part of public economics, the economics of government intervention in the economy. And what the government tries to do, or supposedly tries to do, is good. The government intervenes in the economy, in this case on behalf of the environment, in order to make things better. And in order to do that, you need to have some notion of what is good and what is better and what is best. Some of the questions that we will be looking at in this course in environmental economics are positive questions. What happens if I implement a carbon tax? Do emissions go up or down, and by how much? Those are positive questions, but some of the questions that we're going to look at are normative questions. How high should the carbon tax be? And in order to answer that question, you have to have some sort of notion of what is in the best interest of society. Now, most of economics is formulated around utilitarian ethics, which would be fine if it were not for the case that utilitarian ethics is actually a minority position in ethics, and many people who are not academics find utilitarianism actually quite obnoxious. So if you're going to be a utilitarianist, then at least you should know where you stand and where you come from. So I'm going to talk first about naturalist moral philosophy, and then later on about humanist moral philosophies, that is libertarianism and utilitarianism, before turning to sustainability. Now, you can't talk about ethics without talking about Immanuel Kant. His work in the late 18th century is very influential. Philosophers are still trying to figure out what he actually meant. I think that just means he's a bad writer, but that seems to be a minority position. Kant is really one of the preeminent philosophers of all time, and for this particular story we only need to understand two things that Kant did. One is that he introduced the notion of a moral agent. That's equivalent to an economic agent. Essentially, the moral agent is the unit of analysis in ethics. And he also introduced the rule of universality. That is, if a rule applies to one moral agent, it applies to any and all moral agents. So to give an example, if you and I are both moral agents, and I think that, and I argue that you cannot take my stuff, then by implication, I cannot take your stuff. And if you and I are both moral agents, and you argue that I cannot chop off your hands, then by implication you cannot chop off my hands. So that is essentially what Kant did. It is slightly different than the Christian do not unto others what you would not want them to do to you, but it is very, very similar. The key question here is, of course, who or what is a moral agent? And let's start with Jeremy Bentham. In Bentham's time, only rich white men had the vote, and therefore the government served the interests of rich white men. And Bentham argued that the government should instead work towards the greatest good for the greatest number. And essentially, Bentham was considered a left-wing radical at the moment. He argued that the government should also look after poor white men. And that particular reasoning set in motion a whole chain of events, because this type of argument was made by rich white men, and Jeremy Bentham was a rich white man. And essentially, he argued that we should not just look after ourselves and after things that are like us, rich white men, but we should consider something more broader than that. It should not be the pure self-interest. Bentham, of course, nowadays is seen as fairly right-wing, but at that time this was a radical left-wing position. The government should care for the poor. Poor lives matter. Didn't stop there. At one point, people began to argue that women are people too. Another radical notion, and that voting rights should be extended to women. And it didn't just stop there. People who are not white should perhaps be allowed to vote as well. That was another fairly radical notion that was introduced. And at that point, it was still rich white men who were arguing this. At that point, you need to begin to think, what is the distinguishing feature? Who matters and who does not, and why do we set, how do we set them apart? And it could no longer be on the amount of money in your bank account. It could no longer be about the shape of your genitals. It could no longer be about the color of your skin. So what was it? And some people began to say, well, it's actually what sets us apart is our ability to distinguish ourselves from our environment, and to tell us apart, to tell us apart from the environment, and therefore have some idea of cause and consequence. But that created a problem. If you put a human in front of a mirror, that human recognizes itself. If you put a parrot in front of a mirror, then that parrot does not recognize itself and starts talking to itself, not realizing that the other parrot is not talking back. So parrots cannot tell themselves from their environment, as far as we know. But elephants can, and dolphins can, and chimps and gorillas can tell themselves apart from their environment. So if that is your distinguishing feature, that was essentially initially introduced to set humans apart from other animals, actually on reflection turned out to be not such a distinguishing feature, and therefore certain rights and duties that we assign to human beings should also be assigned to higher animals. And a lot of people would agree to this principle, and for instance, England has had for a very long time laws again that prevent or should prevent cruelty against animals, and this is part of that. And just as we say, well, you can't torture a human being, we actually also would say you can't torture elephants or chimps for no reason. Other people say that it's not so much the notion of cause and consequence, but it's rather the experience, the ability to experience pain and pleasure, and then essentially those rights and duties are extended to most animals. Parrots, that I mentioned, a parrot, as I said, cannot recognize itself. This is a parakeet. A parakeet cannot recognize itself in the mirror, but it can definitely experience pain and presumably also pleasure, and this goes for lots and lots of other animals. Maybe, and these are recent findings in biology and ecology, maybe also to certain types of plants also seem to be able to communicate with each other and seem to be able to experience stress. Now we're beginning to sort of stretch things into what a lot of people would find, this is a bit weird. But the deeper or the more fundamentalist sects in Hinduism would extend this further and say, well, you shouldn't kill insects, for instance, because your grandfather may have reincarnated in this particular insect, and they essentially extend certain rights to all living beings. Um, and again, this is sort of taking sort of the slope from it's not just about what rich white men who do all the arguing about this are like, but it is what sets them apart from others. And if you chop a human into two, then you have two half humans, both halves are dead. If you chop a worm into two, you have two viable worms. And the reason that worms respond differently to being chopped into than human beings is because we have a central nervous system and worms do not, and therefore the two halves are viable organisms. The same holds for octopuses. Octopuses do not have a central brain like we do, but they in fact have 9 brains, 1 in what could be considered their head and 8 in their tentacles, 1 each, and that allows them to coordinate what they're doing. But whereas worms are particularly stupid animals, octopuses are in fact very intelligent and clearly able to experience emotion and fear and pleasure and all those sort of things, but are based on completely different anatomical principles than we are. So if your argument is, well, it's not about are things like us, but are things able to function a little bit like us, or even are they able to function and experience things. And if that is your line of argument, then we should protect all living beings. But there is another problem with that, and that it's actually very difficult to tell living from non-living beings. And every so often you see a flare-up in the media that life has been discovered on Mars or on the Moon, but really what has been discovered is organic material, and under a telescope it's very hard to tell apart organic material. It's actually impossible to tell apart organic material that results from something that once lived and organic material that originates from something that never lived. And that explains why occasionally we find organic material in outer space without actually having proven that things are alive or were alive there. And similarly, if you go to the molecular level, it's actually, there's a debate in microbiology whether or not viruses are alive, and they share some characteristics from material that has never been alive and some characteristics of material that is clearly alive, and there's somewhere in between alive and not. And if you cannot tell things more related apart by the color of their skin, then perhaps you cannot tell them apart by whether or not they have lived or are capable of life. And that may strike you as very, very strange, but for instance, a lot of Aboriginal native cultures put rights and put sort of give moral status to inanimate objects. And what you're looking at here is a holy rock in Australia that, according to the Aboriginals, is very important and hosts the spirits of their ancestors. So it's not strange or not human to give these sort of moral rights to inanimate objects. And some deep ecologists, I'll get back to them later, ascribe sort of the same moral rights to coal reserves or oil reserves, just as it's not okay for me to chop you in half or deplete you by taking away half of your stuff. The same is true for an oil reserve, and it's not okay to take away half of that.